On a hot, muggy morning in June of 1914, a 40-year-old physician named Joseph G. Goldberger stepped down from his horse-drawn carriage right out in front of a palatial brick building in rural Georgia. He was impressed, but also confused by the grandiose architecture. It looked more like a state capitol than what it really was, a mental hospital. The doctor shielded his eyes from the sun and loosened his collar and fanned his face with a stack of papers as sweat poured down his body. He had traveled all over the world in his work for the United States Public Health Service, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt heat this oppressive. He hoped that once he got inside, it would be a bit cooler. So Dr. Goldberger paid the carriage driver, grabbed his bags, and then marched right up the steps into the front office of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane. The doctor was there on direct orders from the United States Surgeon General to investigate a skin disease called pellagra that was ravaging the American South. The word pellagra was Italian for rough or dry skin, but that name totally understates the danger of this condition. People sometimes called pellagra the disease of the 4 Ds, referring to how it progresses: dermatitis, then diarrhea, then dementia, and then finally death. Until the past decade, there had rarely been a case of pellagra in the United States, but in recent years, it had arrived with a vengeance. And now it was an epidemic. In the American South alone, there were at least 100,000 confirmed cases of pellagra. The U.S. Public Health Service had only been studying pellagra for about 5 years, so they hadn't been able to determine its cause yet, but the leading theory was that it was spread by a type of black fly that feeds on blood. And if that was true, Dr. Goldberger knew he was taking a huge risk coming here. He could get pellagra too. But Dr. Goldberger had been taking risks ever since he was a child, when his family emigrated from Hungary to New York without a cent to their name. And now he was one of the most distinguished physicians in the U.S. Public Health Service, and he had investigated outbreaks of yellow fever, typhus, dengue fever, Schamberg's disease, and typhoid fever, just to name a few. Nearly every time, he'd caught the disease he was fighting. But Dr. Goldberger was a man on a mission. He had to know why there was such a concentration of pellagra cases at places where people lived in large groups, like old age homes, prisons, orphanages, and mental asylums. He decided to start his research at this sanitarium in Georgia, one of the largest mental hospitals in the world with over 3,000 patients, many of which had pellagra. Once the doctor entered the vaulted 4-story entrance hall, he shook hands with the head nurse and explained his plan. He wanted to interview the most advanced pellagra patients first, since they had the most symptoms to study. The nurse led Dr. Goldberger out of the main building, around a fountain, and down a tree-lined road to a 3-story building. She explained that the sanitarium was segregated by gender and race. She was taking him to where the white male patients were kept. They were some of their worst pellagra cases. The doctor followed as she led the way up some stairs and then down a long hallway lined with doors. Moans and babbling voices echoed off the stone walls. Dr. Goldberger glanced through the circular windows on each door as they passed. Patients were crowded several to a room, often with widely differing conditions, from alcoholics to senile old men to people suffering violent psychotic episodes. Some of the patients were there voluntarily, but others were basically prisoners who had been brought against their will. Dr. Goldberger had seen plenty of human suffering throughout his career, but the misery of these men was still hard to witness. Eventually, they stopped at a heavy wooden door. The nurse removed a key from her ring, then unlocked the door and held it open for the doctor. Inside the cramped, low-ceiling room, a tired-looking man sat on a narrow cot. The nurse said he was a local cotton farmer named Henry, and he had one of the worst cases of pellagra at the hospital. Dr. Goldberger flinched at the sharp smell of sweat and body odor inside of the room, and also at the farmer's appearance. His appearance reminded the doctor of medical photos he'd seen of leper colonies in India. The farmer's neck, hands, forearms, and feet were crusted over in this splotchy black mass. As the doctor stepped closer, he could see that the blackness was caused by scabbed-over blood from popped sores. The room was hot and stuffy. The only ventilation was a small window on the far wall. If pellagra was contagious, this was a terrible place to visit an infected patient. But Dr. Goldberger was determined to get to the bottom of this, so he braced himself for the danger ahead and then confidently walked over to the farmer and shook the man's hand. Dr. Goldberger said hello to Henry and asked to hear his story. Henry nodded and then told the doctor that he had admitted himself to the sanitarium a few months ago. At first, Henry thought the rash on his body was just a sunburn, but the rash had continued to spread even when he was out of the sun, and then when the strange, prickly feeling spread to his mouth, he realized this had to be something worse than just a sunburn. He was worried about his wife and his kids catching whatever he had, so he had come here. And this wasn't all. Henry now suffered from near constant diarrhea. He couldn't sleep much or taste food, and his motor skills were deteriorating. He sighed and said he knew there wasn't anything to be done. The staff had told him that since the cause of pellagra still was not known, that meant there weren't any proven treatments. There was very little they could do to help him. Dr. Goldberger asked Henry to stand up so he could examine him. But when the farmer tried to get up, his legs were so shaky he had to immediately sit back down. Dr. Goldberger was shocked to see firsthand what this disease could do to the human body in just a few months. Henry slowly raised his head to look at the doctor. His eyes had trouble focusing, and he spoke in a cracked voice as he explained his situation. His wife was too busy with their kids to actually manage the farm, and so every day Henry was here at the sanitarium was another day they were not able to tend to their crops. And if he was gone much longer, they would lose everything. Dr. Goldberger stared back at Henry and promised him that he would not stop until he discovered what caused his illness. After leaving Henry's room, Dr. Goldberger followed the nurse on a tour of the rest of the sanitarium. He interviewed dozens of men and women of different ages and races. Each case was tragic in its own way. Pellagra was relentless once it took hold. Seeing children covered in painful sores broke Dr. Goldberger's heart. It seemed like there was nothing anybody could do to help them. But what puzzled Dr. Goldberger the most was just how erratic this disease was. It didn't make sense to him why the pellagra hadn't spread further. In these hot, unventilated buildings, he would have thought entire wards would have caught it by now if it was contagious, but only a fraction of the residents were sick. That night, as Dr. Goldberger went over his notes in his room, he realized that the next step was to interview the staff, all 293 of them. The following morning, Dr. Goldberger was given a vacant office to conduct his interviews. He made sure the survey he would give each staff member was very thorough: how long each person had worked at the sanitarium, which ward they were stationed in, what their interactions had been with every patient, as well as everything about their daily routine. One after another, the staff came in, introduced themselves, and patiently answered every question, and all of them were smiling and very helpful. And for some reason, something just didn't seem right to Dr. Goldberger. An hour into the process, it struck him. None of the staff were sick in the slightest. These were people who worked in buildings full of patients with pellagra, yet none of them showed even a single symptom of having caught the disease. This made Dr. Goldberger wonder, was pellagra really contagious? The prevailing medical theory was that pellagra was an infectious bacteria carried by insects that spread the disease with their bites. If that theory was right, then why were these insects only infecting patients and not the staff? Black flies looking for blood will bite anyone. Dr. Goldberger suspected that something else besides black flies must be causing this disease. In fact, he wondered if pellagra was really an infectious disease at all. He almost laughed out loud with relief. This might be the first time in his career of fighting epidemics that he himself did not get sick. And so if this theory Dr. Goldberger was thinking about was correct, then it was totally useless to make people sick with pellagra stay in isolation. The much more important task was trying to figure out what was causing the pellagra in all these people. Thankfully, the hospital had a telephone. Once Dr. Goldberger wrapped up his interviews with the staff, he called the Surgeon General and received permission to continue his investigation. Dr. Goldberger wanted to inspect another hotbed of pellagra outbreaks, this time at an orphanage in Jackson, Mississippi. And as Dr. Goldberger headed to his room to pack, one of the nurses pulled him aside. She said she had bad news. Henry, the local cotton farmer, had just been found dead inside of his room. Dr. Goldberger shook his head. He wondered how many more people like Henry would die before he could figure out what was causing this horrible disease. Two days later, Dr. Goldberger hurried toward the entrance of the Methodist Orphan Asylum in Jackson, Mississippi, hoping to get out of the blinding sun. He hadn't thought it possible, but somehow it felt even hotter here than in Georgia. And the stakes were a lot higher here, too. Here, the people suffering were children. Children who had no families to comfort them. The orphanage looked far more welcoming than the imposing sanitarium. It reminded Dr. Goldberger of a small country church, with an arched entryway and 2 bell towers above. Inside, the matron who ran the orphanage introduced herself and showed the doctor to his guest quarters in the visitors' wing. After putting away his things, he followed her on a tour of the building. Despite the building's friendly exterior, Dr. Goldberger realized the place needed serious maintenance. As the matron showed him around, he could see cracks in the ceiling, and the bathrooms smelled swampy, like they'd recently flooded or had plumbing problems. The staff was also quite small compared to the number of kids they were caring for, but the kids were relatively well behaved and happy. The doctor poked his head in one of the dormitories and noticed the majority of the beds were made. When they approached the hospital ward, the matron warned Dr. Goldberger to brace himself for a very unpleasant sight. The ward was a long, low room lined with narrow beds, almost like an army barracks. Fully 1/3 of the orphanage, 68 kids, were isolated here because they all had signs of pellagra. In some kids, the pellagra rash had spread up their neck and onto their face. As Dr. Goldberger followed the matron through the room, a particularly sad-looking girl who looked to be about 8 years old caught his eye. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed holding a book. Dr. Goldberger noticed stripes of red sores creeping out beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. The doctor sat down next to her and asked how she was feeling. The girl said she couldn't sleep anymore because her body constantly itched all over, and whenever she scratched it, her skin burned like it was on fire. She peeled back the collar of her shirt to show him. Her neck was ringed in a dark, scaly rash. Dr. Goldberger patted her hands and told her to stay strong. He was going to do everything he could to help her. She nodded, but she did not seem convinced. As Dr. Goldberger looked around the ward, he realized that nearly all of the kids were within a couple of years of this little girl's age. He saw almost no preschoolers or teenagers, even though the orphanage provided homes for kids from birth to age 18. Dr. Goldberger was puzzled, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Dr. Goldberger stood up and followed the matron outside to where a group of older children were helping build a storage shed. The matron explained to the doctor that that was today's chore. As Dr. Goldberger watched these teenagers sawing and hammering planks of wood out in the sun, he was struck by the contrast between them and all the younger children inside the hospital ward. These older kids looked so happy and healthy, and none had even the faintest sign of pellagra. The doctor jotted down some observations in his notebook and then followed the matron to their final stop, the nursery. Inside, it was loud and crowded, with infants and small children scattered all about. Some were playing with blocks and old weathered toys, while others napped on cots. The room felt hot and chaotic, but as Dr. Goldberger studied these kids, he couldn't see any signs of sickness. They were just maybe a bit dirty, like you'd expect active kids to be, and so it comforted Dr. Goldberger to see some signs of normalcy here. After dinner, the doctor stayed up for a while organizing his research. He was beginning to see strange patterns in who got pellagra and who didn't. At the sanitarium in Georgia, pellagra had struck people from every age group, from grandparents to young kids. But here, at this orphanage, all the pellagra patients were the same age group, between 6 and 12. This was new. He'd never encountered a disease before that only affected people of certain ages. Dr. Goldberger now felt confident pellagra was not spread by black flies, but he had a new riddle to solve. Why would infants and older kids not get pellagra, while the kids in the middle of those two groups were getting so sick? Dr. Goldberger laid in bed, thinking in circles and listening to the drone of cicadas outside. But he couldn't sleep. He just couldn't get those faces of the kids in the sick ward out of his mind. The next morning, Dr. Goldberger woke up early, gathered his notes, and called a meeting with the matron. He wanted to know every detail of how the kids at the orphanage were cared for, from daily activities to sleeping arrangements to meals. The matron explained that they tried to make the kids' lives as normal as possible, but it had grown more difficult in recent years because of cutbacks to the orphanage's funding. The staff had been forced to ration the more expensive foods. For instance, now only the youngest kids were given milk because it was essential to their growth, while all the other kids went without it. The staff had also begun assigning chores to the older kids. The orphanage needed constant repairs, but because of these cutbacks, they could no longer afford to hire outside help. And so in exchange for their labor, the older kids were given bigger and better meals, including meat and vegetables, at least once a week. By comparison, the kids in the middle, between ages 6 and 12, ate mostly cornmeal with molasses. On rare occasions, they got whatever low-quality meat the orphanage could scrounge up. They got almost no milk or vegetables at all. Dr. Goldberger was stunned. The kids in the 6 to 12 group were not getting enough to eat, and they were overwhelmingly the ones getting pellagra. Of course, he knew that a bad diet could lead to health complications, but it didn't make sense that it would cause something as horrible as pellagra. The doctor then asked the matron if there were any kids in the 6 to 12-year-old age range who showed no signs of pellagra. Unfortunately, almost all of the kids in that middle age group had at least some symptoms of pellagra. But then she smiled and said actually there were a few kids in that age group who were totally healthy. They were 3 troublemaking 12-year-olds named Charlie, Henry, and Frank. That was not what Dr. Goldberger wanted to hear. If some of the kids eating this terrible diet were not getting the disease, then food had nothing to do with who got sick. The matron led the doctor outside to a courtyard where the 3 troublemaking boys were running around playing tag. None of them looked sick at all, even though they lived in a facility full of kids their age ravaged by disease. So what made these 3 special? Dr. Goldberger walked up to the 3 kids and asked how they'd been feeling lately. The boys looked at each other, confused by the question, then shrugged and ran off to continue their game. The doctor smiled. Disinterest was a normal reaction for happy, distracted kids. They clearly were not worried about their health. So the doctor thanked the matron and then headed back to his room, wondering if Charlie, Henry, and Frank held some secret to avoiding pellagra. And if they did, he desperately needed to know what it was. Dr. Goldberger stayed up late that night trying to solve the riddle of the 3 healthy boys. He combed through all the existing research on pellagra, searching for an answer for why they were not getting sick. He got so lost in thought that when he finally looked up, it was almost midnight. He decided a little breath of cool night air might help him sleep easier, so he got up and left the room. But just as he closed the door and stepped into the hallway, Dr. Goldberger heard hushed voices. In the otherwise silent orphanage, the sound echoed. He held his breath and listened. There they were again, whispers and then footsteps. The doctor tiptoed towards where the noise was coming from, and he peered around the corner just in time to see the doors to the cafeteria's kitchen swinging shut. The doctor crept along the hallway to the cafeteria entrance, and when he got there, he put his ear up to the door, and he could hear inside the cafeteria cupboards opening and excited voices muttering. The doctor peeked through the gap between the double doors, and he stifled a laugh. The 3 boys from earlier, Charlie, Henry, and Frank, were raiding the pantry. Dr. Goldberger was tempted to leave them be, but he realized that whatever they were eating might explain why they had not caught pellagra. So he slipped into the kitchen and cleared his throat. The boys instantly spun around, embarrassed looks all over their faces. They'd been caught red-handed, and there was no hiding it. But Dr. Goldberger immediately assured them that they were not in trouble. In fact, he said, they could actually be a big help to him. All he needed to know was what they were eating. If they told him, he'd go back to his room, and this could be their little secret. The boys exchanged confused glances, and then nodded to each other. They went to the pantry and pulled out the food they'd been stealing. A few peaches, a handful of peanuts, and some leftover chicken. Dr. Goldberger smiled, and then, in a conspiratorial whisper, asked them if they'd done this before. The boys' faces went red, and they looked down at their feet, and then one of them quietly admitted that yes, they had. Dr. Goldberger felt a surge of excitement. He thanked the boys for their honesty, then left them to their midnight snack. As the doctor headed back to his room, his mind spun with activity. He knew he was close to a breakthrough. By morning, he had devised a plan to test his theory. If it worked, he could finally solve the mystery of what was causing pellagra, and he could save countless lives. But Dr. Goldberger's experiment would take a little patience and more than a little danger for the people who actually took part in it. 8 months later, in February of 1915, on a pleasantly cool Mississippi morning, Dr. Goldberger stood outside of a brick building that looked just like a castle, complete with turrets and battlements. This would be his new home for the next 6 months, and where his grand experiment would take place, Rankin State Prison Farm. He needed a controlled environment for his test to be scientific, and this place was as controlled as it got. To date, there had been 0 cases of pellagra at this prison. But if the doctor's theory was correct, that would not be the case for much longer. Dr. Goldberger regretted what he was about to do. Pellagra killed about 1 out of every 30 people, and if he wasn't careful, his experiment could cost lives. But he didn't feel like he had a choice. People were counting on him. Already, dozens of his patients at the sanitarium and orphanage had died, and the pellagra outbreaks at those locations were not showing any signs of slowing down. So Dr. Goldberger went inside, and the warden then led him to the setting for his experiment, a prison within the prison. It was a private, newly built barracks with barred cells, a cafeteria, and a small screened-in yard. Throughout the experiment, the inmates here would have no contact with the rest of the prison population, so there could be no contamination. In exchange for agreeing to be a human guinea pig for 6 months, the 11 prisoners in the experiment would be given full pardons, $5, and a new suit. The warden then gave his sign to his staff, and the prisoners were brought in. 11 hardened men in pinstripe jumpsuits. Dr. Goldberger watched them file in for breakfast, taking a plate of food from the cafeteria workers and then settling in at a long table. Everyone was tense and alert, like nobody knew what to expect. But once they began eating, the mood turned festive. They cleared their plates, went for seconds, and cracked jokes about how lucky they were. This was a vacation compared to what they were used to. But Dr. Goldberger knew that if his experiment worked, the next 6 months would be anything but relaxing. Because if his suspicions were correct, then these men would contract pellagra and all the horrible suffering that came with it. Almost 6 months later, Dr. Goldberger woke early in his room at the prison and pulled out his calendar. It was the 2nd week of September. The experiment's deadline was approaching fast, and he wasn't getting the results he had hoped for. In 6 weeks, all the funding for this would end, the barracks would be dismantled, and the prisoners would walk free. But there really was nothing Dr. Goldberger could do to make things move faster. The experiment had to move at its own pace. A few inmates had complained of some new ailments, headaches, backaches, dizziness, nausea, but they were nothing that could be pinpointed as pellagra. Just then, a guard knocked on the door and said there'd been an incident with one of the prisoners, who was now restrained in his cell and demanding to talk to the doctor. Dr. Goldberger followed the guard to the prisoner's cell, and as soon as the inmate caught sight of the doctor, the inmate began yelling. He called Dr. Goldberger a crook and shouted that he'd rather just serve his entire sentence back inside the regular prison than stay another second in this hell. Dr. Goldberger was not surprised. The joyful mood from the beginning of this experiment had totally worn off. Many of the inmates were grouchy and irritable, and he was getting yelled at a lot. Dr. Goldberger watched the prisoner thrash against his restraints and howl, when suddenly the doctor caught a glimpse of something through a tear in the prisoner's shoulder seam. The doctor called for the guards to come open up the cell, and then once they had, Dr. Goldberger rushed in and stretched that rip in the prisoner's shoulder even wider, and when he did, boom, there it was. A scaly rash stretching along the prisoner's shoulder blades and up around the base of his neck. Dr. Goldberger then pulled up the prisoner's shirt, and the man's torso was a trail of blackened rashes and pimply sores. There was no doubt this man had pellagra, and he didn't catch it from another prisoner or from the guards. This man must have gotten pellagra from Dr. Goldberger's experiment. Dr. Goldberger asked the guards to please send all the other inmates back to their cells. The doctor wanted to do a full-body checkup on each of them. Once all the prisoners were ready, Dr. Goldberger slowly walked along the cell block, scanning each prisoner from head to toe, and as he did, his pen was a blur in his notebook, furiously scribbling detailed descriptions. The doctor couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands were shaking. 5 more men had clear symptoms of pellagra, meaning 6 out of the 11 volunteers had caught the deadly disease. Dr. Goldberger dashed back to his office and quickly sent word to the governor. His experiment had worked. Now it was time to tell the world. What Dr. Goldberger had discovered was shockingly simple. Pellagra was not caused by black flies transmitting a virus or bacteria, and pellagra was not contagious. Pellagra was caused by food. Specifically, it was caused by the traditional American Southern diet in poor households: salt pork, molasses, and cornmeal. If that was all somebody ate, it was highly likely they would get pellagra. And people who supplemented this traditional Southern diet with things like milk and vegetables and fresh meat would not get pellagra. Once these results were published, there were mixed reactions from the scientific community. Some wanted to nominate Dr. Goldberger for a Nobel Prize, but just as many doubted the experiment's results, in particular doctors and officials who lived in the American South. They felt like this northern doctor was criticizing their entire way of life. Dr. Goldberger was frustrated that people were questioning his discovery. After all, he had proven it with the experiment he ran at the prison. The prisoners who had volunteered to be a part of it had followed a strict diet of biscuits, gravy, cornbread, grits, rice, syrup, collard greens, and yams. They could eat as much of these foods as they wanted, but no other types of food. And this diet is what caused half of the prisoners to develop pellagra, just like the residents of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane and the children between the ages of 6 and 12 at the orphanage. They all got pellagra from their diet. Still, while Dr. Goldberger had proven that a better, more varied diet was enough to prevent pellagra, he had not actually figured out why that was. It would take another 20 years until scientists actually proved what caused pellagra. It is caused from a deficiency of vitamin B3, also known as niacin. The traditional post-Civil War Southern diet of dried meat, molasses, and cornmeal severely lacked this nutrient, which is why the region was hit so much harder than other areas in America. But once people started adding niacin back into their diet, mostly in the form of enriched flour, the disease no longer manifested, and almost everyone already suffering from it recovered. All told, over 100,000 people died of pellagra between 1900 and 1940 until it disappeared with the identification of niacin. Sadly, Dr. Goldberger died before this discovery of an unrelated and extremely rare form of cancer. However, Dr. Goldberger will always be remembered because he was the one who cracked the riddle of pellagra and saved tens of thousands of lives. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police and they're in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns and multiple blasts because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There is some real aggression here. This is not an accident. This is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open, and look, I just bought a new Rolex. His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on, what fun thing am I going to do with my money next? After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So for $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though realistically, Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it. And she would tell the police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion, knowing exactly what they're going to find, and they go in and they put on this big performance. Oh my goodness, someone killed our parents! But it was all a lie, because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons, but actually just recently, they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA trading cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card. And he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Privilege.
On the evening of Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, a man named Jacob Franks walked up the steps to his mansion, and right as he went to open his door, his butler opened it up, welcomed him inside, and Jacob smiled at the butler and stepped in. Jacob had just spent a long day at his office in Chicago, Illinois, doing a big real estate deal, and now he was just happy to be home with his wife and his 3 kids. Jacob was an incredibly successful business person who had made a name for himself first in the early 1900s when he ran a bank that specialized in giving out these enormous loans to gamblers. But it wasn't until he was named the president of the Rockford Watch Company and he expanded into real estate that he became outrageously wealthy. His fortune in today's dollars would have been around $70 million. But now that Jacob was so well established in the business world in Chicago, he was trying to make a more conscious effort to spend more time at home with his wife and kids. And so as soon as he walked past his butler into his mansion, he hung up his hat and his jacket, and he went to find his wife, Flora, to tell her about an idea he had for a trip for that upcoming weekend. But when Jacob found Flora, she was not remotely interested in talking about their weekend plans, because Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and she had no idea where he was. And Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. He was a student at a prestigious boys' school right down the road, and his teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade. Bobby was a member of the school's debate team and regularly beat the older kids, and Bobby was just a natural leader and very hardworking and kind. But Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. This was not the first time that Bobby had not come home by curfew. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. This is something Bobby does. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house. Richard was Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14, but they really bonded over tennis, and so that was something they did all the time. And so Jacob said he would go across the street and see if Bobby was there, and he also told his wife, Flora, to just continue to call around town and see if anybody knew where Bobby might be. And so Jacob left his mansion and began walking across the street towards Richard's family's mansion to see if his son was there. Now, this neighborhood that Jacob lived in was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods really in the entire country, but definitely within Chicago's city limits. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, and all the families who lived in this neighborhood had a full staff of maids and butlers and drivers and fleets of private cars. I mean, these people who lived in South Kenwood were literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he looks around the side, and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play, but it's totally vacant, and in fact, the house is just totally quiet. No one's home. When Jacob got back to his own home, he found his wife pacing around in the parlor looking really concerned, and so Jacob immediately asked her, what'd you learn? What's going on? And she would tell Jacob that she had spoken to one of Bobby's friends who told her that Bobby had umpired a baseball game after school and had left to walk back home at around 5 p.m. The school and the baseball field where Bobby would have been was only about 3 blocks away from their home. And now it was 6:30 p.m. So it's been an hour and a half since Bobby had supposedly began his walk home. And so by now he certainly should be here, but of course he wasn't. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety, despite the fact that he's thinking, okay, well, my son is likely somewhere in this neighborhood in South Kenwood, one of the safest, richest, best places in the country. He's got to be okay, but I really want to find him. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, who also happened to be a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. When the state senator friend arrived at Jacob's house, the two men left and began walking down the street lined with mansions, making their way towards the school where Bobby supposedly had been umpiring. And when they got there, they saw there was no baseball game happening, and the school was dark and closed for the night. But Jacob and his friend decided that, maybe it was possible that after umpiring this game, when Bobby had begun his walk home, maybe he had taken a detour into the school to get something, and then perhaps the doors got shut and locked on him. And so Jacob and his friend went to the school and looked for a way to basically break into the school. And sure enough, they would find an open window, they'd open it up, they would climb inside, and they would search the entire school, but Bobby was not in there. At this point, Jacob was really starting to panic. His friend was trying to calm him down, but Jacob is now thinking, something is terribly wrong with my son. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, Jacob immediately called out to his wife to see if maybe she had located Bobby, but when he called Flora's name, there was no response. And so Jacob and his friend, they run inside and they make their way towards the parlor, which is where they had last seen Flora before they left. And when they walked in there, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And so Jacob and the senator, they run over and they begin shaking Flora, and suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. And after Jacob finally calmed her down, she would tell him that after they had left to go to the school, she had received a phone call. And at first, she thought it was Bobby calling to check in. But when she answered it, it wasn't Bobby, it was a man's voice she didn't recognize, who told her that Bobby had been kidnapped. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. This mystery man also told Flora that they would be in touch soon with more information, and then they hung up. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted, and that was why they found her on the ground. That night, Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. Of course, they wanted to go to police, but this felt like a credible threat that Bobby could be harmed if they did that. And so they just went back and forth over how to handle this horrible situation. But by 2 a.m., they had made a decision. The state senator had some close friends and connections in the police department, and so they decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy so the kidnapper or kidnappers wouldn't know the police were investigating. And so, a few hours later, when the police department opened up, Jacob and the state senator friend went to the police, they spoke to the highest ranking officer who was sworn to secrecy, and then that morning, the police would begin a quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company, and after parking the car, Morton got out, he went inside of the shop, and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. The clerk would ask Morton, how did it go with your rental car? And Morton would say, oh, it was perfect, went totally fine. After that, Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend, Lewis Mason. And once Morton had climbed inside, the two men smiled and drove off and disappeared into traffic. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money, but before he could actually deliver the money to the kidnappers at the location they had specified in this letter, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It would take over a week to unravel this bizarre clue, but it all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. Here is the shocking story that detectives were finally able to piece together about what happened to Bobby Franks. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. He would tell the front desk that he wanted them to hold his mail for him, and over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. Finally, a suspicious maid at the Morrison Hotel, who had been going into room 1031 every day to clean it, only to discover that Morton was not in there and the room was totally untouched and clean already, she went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. And instead of the suitcase containing clothes or toiletries, it just contained a bunch of random library books. As it happened, after this maid found this strange suitcase full of books, Morton stopped coming to the hotel. He stopped getting his mail, he did not claim his luggage, and he didn't pay the bill. He just kind of vanished. On May 9th, so just a couple of days after Morton first booked that room at the Morrison Hotel, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. The rental company would not just let anybody take a Willis Knight car. You needed a reference to show that you were someone who could pay for this type of vehicle, and so Morton's friend, Lewis Mason, would give him that reference and allow him to rent the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, on May 21st, so the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood in their Willis Knight car when they spotted Bobby by himself walking down the road. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And so Lewis, who was in the front seat of the car, told Morton, who was driving, to pull over so Lewis could talk to Bobby. And so Morton pulled over, Lewis rolled his window down, he called over to Bobby. Bobby came over, and before long, Lewis and Bobby were talking about this tennis racket. And then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home, because that was where Bobby was walking to when they stopped him. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Morton stayed in the driver's seat, and Bobby climbed inside and sat in the front seat. And then once those two were situated, Morton pulled away from the curb and began driving towards Bobby's house. And as they were driving to Bobby's house, Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket because that was the thing they were talking about. And as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the back seat reached into his pocket, pulled out a chisel, and then lunged forward and began smashing Bobby in the back of the head over and over again with this chisel. And as Bobby is screaming in pain and trying to protect himself, Lewis lunges forward, grabs Bobby, drags him into the back seat, and then holds him down, pulls a rag out of his pocket, and jams it into Bobby's throat. And then he closes Bobby's mouth and holds it shut until Bobby goes still. After that, Lewis kind of grimaced at all of Bobby's blood all over him, and he kind of pushed Bobby down onto the floorboards below, and then Lewis calmly climbed back into the front seat and sat down, and meanwhile, Morton has not remotely reacted to what's just happened. This is just business as usual. Morton and Lewis did not go to Bobby's house, but instead drove towards Indiana. And on their drive to Indiana, they would stop at a roadside restaurant and eat hot dogs and root beers with their car parked right near this restaurant with Bobby's body just totally exposed laying out on the floorboards of the back seat. Morton and Lewis would eventually get into Indiana, and they would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. And when they got to this forest, they parked in this clearing. They got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead. So they pulled him out, they stripped all of his clothes off of him, they rolled him up in a rug, and then they dragged him over to this drainage pipe that sat underneath some railroad tracks in this swampy area, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they got back in their car, they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother, Flora, and informed her that her son was kidnapped, but alive, even though he wasn't, and don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. That night, Morton and Lewis would burn all of the clothes they had stripped off of Bobby. They would also clean the interior of their Willis Knight rental car, and then they would play a game of cards together before going to bed. The next day, May 22nd, so the same day that police began their quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora demanding $10,000 for the safe return of Bobby. But unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. In fact, that day he was discovered. A walker was cutting through the woods in Indiana and saw Bobby in the pipe. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, the family's never going to pay for their son because he's dead, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him in the woods in Indiana. And Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. In fact, there was only one store in the world that sold this particular kind of eyeglasses. And so when detectives got the call about Bobby's body being found, they would also find these glasses. And that was the big clue. Because these glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. And when detectives went to Morton, Morton immediately pointed the finger at Lewis, saying that Morton didn't do anything to Bobby, Lewis did. But about a week later, on May 31st, both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. But far more shocking than what Morton and Lewis had done was who they were. Because Morton and Lewis were not their real names. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names, Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then they booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. Now, they had no intention of actually staying at this hotel, and so they just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there. But in reality, the only reason they booked that room is they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. And so after booking this room, they began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason at the Morrison Hotel, room 1031. And then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that. And then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. And then once they had their luxury car, it was time to go kill. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. His father was the president of a very successful steamship company, and Nathan was planning to attend Harvard University in the fall to get yet another college degree. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan. He graduated at 17 years old. And to celebrate the occasion, Richard's father, who in today's dollars was worth about $175 million, he was a retired vice president for the major retail store Sears, he bought Richard a custom golf course. He built him his own golf course. That was his graduation present. And at the time of Bobby's murder, Richard was actually enrolled at the University of Chicago's law school, studying to become a lawyer. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they didn't kill Bobby to get money out of his parents. Nathan and Richard were fabulously wealthy. The money meant nothing. Instead, they had come up with this scheme and killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of supermen. Men whose superiority allows them to rise above all ordinary rules, ethics, and laws. Basically, Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else in the world that if they wanted to kill someone, they should be able to. And Bobby seemed like a pretty easy target. After Nathan and Richard confessed, they were put under arrest, but a chauffeur was allowed to come to the police station and drop off silk pajamas for them to wear in custody, and instead of being held in a cell, they were allowed to stay in a hotel. But ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Bobby's family never recovered from his murder, and his father, Jacob, would die just 4 years after his son died. As for Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate, and as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled, and then die of natural causes in 1971. Today, the murder of Bobby Franks is often referred to as the crime of the century.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen.